I'm going to talk about my family's linguistic heritage. My husband is fifth generation immigrant, possibly sixth, we're not quite sure, generation immigrant from today's Poland, and his family still considers themselves Polish. They even call themselves Polacks, a word which can be viewed as a slur when used in a derogatory way by people outside of the group, or just an ethnonym when used by the members of the group themselves. Because we live in an area that's almost 50-50 German or Polish ancestry, I'm much more likely to hear the word quote, Polak used in a positive way, sometimes with a little sarcasm, but still generally positive. We know that it all started with Joe Knobloch, a 17-year-old boy who moved here in 1880 and lied that he was 18, otherwise he wouldn't have been admitted. According to the Ellis Island records, he came alone and there was no luggage registered in his name. He literally came with a shirt on his back, according, there's the saying. And that was true about him. He married Celia Kanaski, another Polish immigrant, and they had 12 surviving children together. Gotta love life before birth control. They retained Polish as their main language, and their children also were predominantly Polish speaking. The community was similarly English-Polish bilingual, and so that was not a problem at all. The family adjusted well. They were successful farmers, business owners, and not speaking much English did not hurt their survival, did not hurt their employment opportunities. They were doing just fine. It was my husband's father who switched to English as his main language, and whose Polish was rudimentary. He was the eldest kid in the family, and when he started either kindergarten or first grade, he discovered that they spoke something different at school, came home, told his parents about it, and they implemented an English-only policy in the house. So his younger siblings never learned Polish beyond a few words here and there. This story is in line with the findings by scholars of sociology who say that heritage languages are usually lost in a matter of 3 generations. The first generation immigrants are fluent in them. The second generation can use some, but not as freely as native speakers. And the third generation usually switches to the language of their new place completely, with just a few words retained as tokens of their ancestry. Despite not knowing any Polish, my relatives and many people in the community still consider themselves at least somewhat Polish. The words that seem to be passed down the generations longer than others seem to be swear words. There must be something special about them. One of the words that my relatives still use is dupa, which is the Polish word for the butt, the body part. Why it's so important that it was retained, it's a mystery to me. I don't know. I am just telling you what it is. Another is they call grandmother Busha, not Nana like some other groups, not other words for grandma. And Busha is a shortened version of Polish babushka, which is a word for grandma. This one is a funny case. They use a word usiądź, and I heard my sisters-in-law use that. And when I asked, they told me that it's a word for bad kid, naughty kid. However, I looked it up and I found that it means sit down in Polish. When I asked, they said, well, it probably did. It made sense because grandma always yelled at misbehaving grandchildren, and she did mean sit down and stop doing what you're doing. But they always felt that it was a word used to scold a naughty child. So in their mind, that word connects to something like stop it or bad kid. So that's Usanch. Their last name was originally Knoblauch. It's funny enough, it's a German word and it means garlic. So that tells you how high our ancestry is and how fancy and refined we are. And it was even spelled with CH on old tombstones, just like it is spelled in German. And it was pronounced with the sound, which exists in German, exists in Polish, does not exist in English. And so no English-speaking people could pronounce the Knoblauch. And the descendants of the original Knoblauchs made a spelling adjustment and changed it to Knoblauch with CK in the end instead of CH. And they still pronounce both the K and N sound in the beginning as Knoblauch when they're in Huron County, because that's how it's always been pronounced. Everybody in that community understands it without difficulty, and it's fine. But those who moved out of the Thumb and settled and made their lives somewhere else, they usually end up changing their pronunciation to Knoblauch. I guess a person gets tired of explaining how to pronounce their name all the time, so they just make the change. Switching to our own nuclear family, we mostly use English for communication, but we made a conscious choice to raise our children bilingual. It was very difficult because there was no community around them, and most of language development was natural only the first 2-3 years, when communicating with a mother is basically enough for language development, for normal, healthy language development. But as soon as friends, extended family, school comes into play, English took off and started developing rapidly and well, and Russian was left to linger like a sickly plant that's being kept alive by extraordinary efforts of a gardener, but is not happy in its current location. So we had to make an effort to create artificial communicative situations for our kids by speaking Russian to them, by teaching them to read Russian before they started kindergarten and learned how to read English, by taking them to Russia to see their family at least once a year, and making sure to provide them with all possible and impossible social opportunities to interact with kids their age. We also moved countless suitcases between continents with books, school materials, tapes, videotapes at first, and then CDs later, and tried to make them watch Russian cartoons, movies, kids shows. We read stories and did all kinds of exciting things. So there was one school year that we spent in Russia. Our daughter was in 4th grade, and so we placed her in a Russian school, and our son was 4 years of age, and we put him in Russian daycare. They call them kindergartens there, and they're more like a preschool with a little music class, some story time, movement and rhythm class, outdoor games, a little bit of ABCs, a little bit of 1, 2, 3s. And so the effect of age on the language development can be illustrated by our kids' experience during that year. Neither of them had a foreigner accent. Both were young enough to have phonetic pronunciation of native speaker. Our daughter, who was 8 or 9 at the time, spoke okay, but sometimes her sentences were full of Russian words but with English grammar. She improved considerably. Her vocabulary was comparable to her friends, but she never really achieved the same level of grammatical, syntactic development as the local kids of her age, and idioms remained difficult for her. She would translate them word for word, which doesn't work. She retained most of her boost, though, even after returning to the U.S. and continuing school here with no trouble. Our son was 4, and his language change was much more dramatic. After 2 months, he was indistinguishable from local kids of his age. His pronunciation, vocabulary, and syntax were native-like. His English, however, nearly died. After about 3 months, his phone conversations with Dad in English turned to uh-huh, 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 I don't know, and he would give the phone back to me. He couldn't or didn't want to communicate in English anymore. As soon as he returned back to the U.S., however, his Russian started declining, and his English took off and took over as the dominant language. And we were back to Mom inventing treasure hunts, story adventures to keep communicating in Russian and practicing reading and writing Russian as artificial communicative situations in the absence of natural communicative situations. Because they're nearly balanced bilinguals, though, both my kids learned Spanish much quicker and easier than their classmates. Their English language arts have always been excellent, and there were several job opportunities that they got because of their bilingualism and actually functional trilingualism. I expect that my grandchildren will not speak Russian, not much, if any at all. It seems that we will follow the three-generation rule. The first-generation immigrant is fluent in the heritage language. The second generation knows it but is more comfortable in the new language, and the third generation retains maybe a few words like ushanj and some anecdotes, but usually the heritage language is lost by the third generation, and we seem to be following that pattern. That's our story.